Robert Caldwell stood behind the velvet curtain of the shopping mall's North Pole setup, adjusting the fake white beard that scratched against his jaw, and he could not believe what he had just witnessed. The general manager of Pinewood Shopping Center, a man named Derek Hoffman, had just physically removed a 7-year-old boy from Santa's lap, calling him a dirty beggar in front of dozens of families waiting in line, all because the child had asked for a winter coat for his sick mother instead of a toy for himself. Robert's hands trembled, not from the cold of the air-conditioned mall, but from a rage so profound it felt like ice water flooding his veins. He was not just any Santa Claus volunteer. He was Robert Caldwell, founder and CEO of Caldwell Real Estate Holdings, a company worth $4.2 billion, and he owned the parent corporation that held the master lease agreement for every single square foot of this shopping center. Derek Hoffman had just humiliated a child in front of the man who could erase his entire career with a single phone call, and he had absolutely no idea. I am so glad you are here. If you are watching this video, please like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are listening to my story from. I want to know how far it has reached. 5 years ago, Robert had lost everything that mattered. His only son, Michael, had died in a car accident 2 weeks before Christmas, and the world had lost all its color since that day. Michael had been 8 years old, with bright green eyes and an infectious laugh that made strangers smile on the subway. Every Christmas, Robert and Michael had a tradition. They would visit shopping malls together, and Michael would sit on Santa's lap not to ask for toys, but to tell Santa about other children who needed help more than he did. Michael had a heart too big for his small body, and he saw the world with a kindness Robert had forgotten existed in the corporate battlefield where he spent most of his days. After Michael's death, Robert had thrown himself into work, building his empire higher and wider, acquiring properties across 15 states. But the holiday season had become unbearable. His penthouse apartment in Manhattan felt like a mausoleum decorated with expensive furniture and complete silence. This year, on the 5-year anniversary of Michael's death, Robert's therapist had suggested something radical. Instead of running from the pain, he should run toward it. She told him to find a way to honor Michael's memory during the season he had loved most. That conversation had led Robert to this moment, standing in a $60 Santa suit he had purchased online, in a middle-class shopping mall 40 minutes outside the city, where nobody would recognize the face of a billionaire who rarely appeared in newspapers. He had contacted the mall's community outreach coordinator, offered to volunteer as Santa Claus for free, and had been accepted immediately. They were desperate for volunteers, especially someone willing to work the evening shifts when working-class families could actually visit. Robert had imagined this experience would bring him peace, perhaps even closure. He had pictured himself listening to children's innocent wishes, remembering Michael's joy, maybe even smiling again for the first time in years. Instead, within his first 2 hours wearing the red suit, he had witnessed something that made his blood boil with a fury he had not felt since the day he buried his son. A little boy named Tommy, wearing a jacket 3 sizes too small and shoes held together with duct tape, had climbed onto Santa's lap with eyes full of hope. The child had whispered his Christmas wish into Robert's ear, and it was not a request for video games or bicycles. Tommy had asked if Santa could bring his mother a warm winter coat, because she had given hers to him, and now she was getting sick from walking to her 2 jobs in the freezing December wind. Robert had felt his heart crack open as he listened to Tommy's wish, and he had been about to promise the boy that Santa would take care of everything when Derek Hoffman had appeared from nowhere. The manager had grabbed Tommy by the arm, yanked him off Santa's lap, and announced loudly to everyone in line that the mall had standards, that they could not have homeless people and beggars using Santa as a charity service, and that families who could not afford to shop at Pinewood Center should find somewhere else to celebrate Christmas. Robert had watched frozen in his Santa suit as Tommy's mother, a thin woman with exhausted eyes and hands red from cold, had apologized profusely while pulling her crying son toward the exit. The other families in line had looked away in embarrassment, nobody daring to challenge the man in the expensive suit who controlled their shopping experience. Derek Hoffman had then turned to Robert, still dressed as Santa, and told him with a condescending smile that he needed to screen children better, that Santa's lap was a premium experience meant to create photo opportunities for paying customers, not a social service for people who contributed nothing to the mall's revenue. The manager had patted Robert on the shoulder, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just signed his own professional death warrant, and walked away to bark orders at a teenage employee about fixing the decorative lights. Robert sat very still in Santa's chair, his mind already working through the mathematics of destruction, calculating exactly how he would dismantle Derek Hoffman's career piece by piece, and he realized that Michael had just given him a gift from beyond the grave, a purpose, a mission, and a reason to feel something other than emptiness during Christmas. Robert Caldwell had not always been a billionaire, and he had certainly not always been the kind of man who forgot where he came from. He had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the son of a factory worker and a public school teacher, in a house where Christmas meant homemade decorations and gifts wrapped in newspaper, because wrapping paper was an unnecessary expense. His father had worked double shifts every December to afford a few presents under their modest tree, and his mother had volunteered at the local church to distribute donated coats and canned food to families even poorer than theirs. Robert had learned early that wealth was not measured in dollar signs, but in the willingness to share what little you had with those who had even less. That lesson had somehow survived his transformation from a scholarship student at Columbia University to a ruthless real estate developer who had built an empire by acquiring distressed properties and converting them into profitable ventures across the American Northeast. When Michael was born, Robert had made a silent promise to himself that his son would never experience the financial anxiety that had marked his own childhood. But he had also sworn that Michael would never become one of those spoiled, disconnected children of privilege who treated service workers like furniture and measured human worth by bank account balances. He and his wife Catherine had raised Michael with intention and care, teaching him that having money meant having responsibility, that privilege was not a right, but an obligation to help others. Every Thanksgiving, they had volunteered at soup kitchens. Every Christmas, Michael had been allowed to choose one toy for himself, and then they would spend an afternoon shopping for 3 toys to donate to children's hospitals. Catherine had died when Michael was 5, a sudden aneurysm that had taken her in her sleep, and after that loss, Robert had poured every ounce of his capacity for love into raising their son alone. Michael had been special in ways Robert still struggled to articulate even 5 years after his death. The boy had possessed an almost supernatural ability to see people, truly see them, in a way most adults never managed. He would strike up conversations with janitors and security guards, remembering their names and asking about their families on subsequent visits. He had once spent an entire afternoon at a shopping mall not looking at toys, but sitting on a bench watching families, and when Robert had asked what he was doing, Michael had explained that he was people-watching because everyone had a story, and most people never bothered to wonder what those stories were. That memory now felt like a knife in Robert's chest as he sat in the Santa chair, watching the families who remained in line after Derek Hoffman's display of cruelty, noticing how they avoided eye contact with him, how they had learned to pretend they had not witnessed an injustice because challenging authority was dangerous and expensive. Robert had spent the last 5 years building his fortune to even greater heights, acquiring properties in 12 additional cities, making strategic investments that had tripled his net worth, but none of it had filled the void Michael had left behind. He had dated occasionally, always women from his own social sphere who understood that relationships among billionaires were transactional arrangements built on mutual benefit rather than genuine connection. He had attended charity galas and written checks with many zeros, but he had felt nothing, absolutely nothing, except the mechanical satisfaction of watching his accountants confirm that his donations were tax-deductible. He had been sleepwalking through life, going through the motions of existence without actually living, until this moment in a cheap Santa suit when Derek Hoffman had reminded him that cruelty still existed in the world and that people with power still used it to crush those without. The next child in line approached Santa's chair, a little girl clutching a list of toys she had carefully written in crayon, and Robert forced himself to smile beneath the fake beard and listen to her wishes with genuine attention. He asked her questions, laughed at her excitement about unicorns and dollhouses, and when her parents took a photo, he waved cheerfully like any mall Santa would. But his mind was already elsewhere, already planning, already pulling threads of memory about Pinewood Shopping Centre and its management structure. He remembered signing the master lease agreement 3 years ago, a transaction so routine that he had delegated it to his vice president of acquisitions, barely glancing at the property details beyond the financial projections. He remembered that the agreement had included strict clauses about community standards, accessibility requirements, and non-discrimination policies that were legally binding. Derek Hoffman had just violated at least 3 separate contractual obligations, and Robert was going to make absolutely certain that violation had consequences that would echo through the man's entire professional life. Robert finished his shift as Santa Claus at 9 o'clock that evening, listening to 43 more children share their Christmas wishes, and not a single moment passed when he stopped thinking about Tommy and his mother walking out of the mall with their heads bowed in shame. He removed the Santa suit in the small changing room behind the North Pole display, carefully folding the red jacket and pants, and as he put on his own clothes, a simple sweater and jeans he had purchased specifically to blend in with the middle-class shoppers, he felt something stirring inside him that he had not experienced in 5 years. It was not quite anger anymore, though the fury still burned beneath his calculated composure. It was purpose. It was the feeling of having a mission that mattered, a goal that extended beyond quarterly earnings reports and acquisition strategies. Michael would have wanted him to do something about what had happened today, and Robert was going to do exactly that. But he was going to do it the right way, the smart way, the way that would create lasting change, rather than temporary satisfaction. He spent the next week conducting reconnaissance, and this was a skill set he had honed over 3 decades of business negotiations and corporate acquisitions. Robert returned to Pinewood Shopping Centre every single day, sometimes as a customer browsing stores, sometimes sitting in the food court with a coffee and a newspaper, always watching and always listening. He observed how Derek Hoffman moved through the mall like a small-time dictator, barking orders at minimum wage employees who flinched when he approached, criticizing store managers for display arrangements that did not meet his arbitrary standards of perfection, and treating security guards like personal servants who existed solely to fulfill his commands. Robert watched Derek humiliate a teenage cashier for being 2 minutes late to her shift, threatening to dock her pay and telling her that people like her were easily replaceable. He saw Derek force a janitor to re-clean an already spotless floor 3 times because he claimed to see a smudge that nobody else could detect. He witnessed Derek turn away several more families who looked too poor or too tired to meet his standards of desirable customers. But Robert was not just observing Derek's personality flaws and management style. He was gathering concrete evidence, and he was doing it with the thoroughness of a man who had built a billion-dollar empire. By understanding that information was the most valuable currency in any negotiation. He befriended several mall employees during their breaks, buying them coffee and listening to their stories, never revealing his true identity, but presenting himself as a concerned citizen who was considering writing a complaint letter to mall management. The stories they shared were worse than he had imagined. Derek had been systematically discriminating against lower-income shoppers for the past 18 months, implementing unofficial policies that encouraged security to follow and harass anyone who looked poor or homeless. He had increased parking fees to levels that priced out working-class families, claiming it would attract a better clientele. He had rejected applications from small businesses and local entrepreneurs who wanted to rent kiosk space, preferring to keep those spots empty rather than allow vendors he considered beneath Pinewood's image. Robert also discovered something that made his investigation significantly more interesting from a legal perspective. Derek had been embezzling money from the mall's community outreach fund, a budget specifically designated for charity events, holiday programs for underprivileged children, and partnerships with local schools. The fund was supposed to contain approximately $75,000 annually, money contributed by store tenants as part of their lease agreements, but Derek had been siphoning off nearly 60% of it for the past 2 years. He had been using the stolen money to fund lavish management conferences at expensive hotels, upgrade his office with luxury furniture, and even lease a high-end sports car that he claimed was necessary for meeting with potential retail tenants. The employees who had access to financial records were too afraid of losing their jobs to report the theft, and the corporate oversight from Robert's own company had been negligent, relying on quarterly reports that Derek had been falsifying with impressive creativity. On the 8th day of his investigation, Robert sat in his penthouse apartment with a leather folder containing 42 pages of documented evidence, including photographs, witness statements, financial records obtained through his company's internal audit access, and a comprehensive timeline of Derek Hoffman's abuses of power. He had enough material to have Derek arrested for embezzlement, sued for discrimination, and permanently blacklisted from every retail management position in the country. But Robert was not interested in simply destroying one arrogant manager's career. He wanted something bigger, something that would honor Michael's memory in a meaningful way. He wanted to transform Pinewood Shopping Center into exactly the kind of place his son would have loved. A place where families like Tommy's would be welcomed and celebrated rather than humiliated and expelled. He picked up his phone and began making calls to his executive team, and by midnight he had set in motion a plan that would change everything. Robert scheduled an emergency board meeting with his executive team for the following Monday morning, and when his 6 most trusted advisors entered the conference room on the 42nd floor of Caldwell Tower in Manhattan, they found their typically stoic CEO standing at the window, with an energy they had not seen in years. His chief operating officer, Margaret Chen, had worked with Robert for 17 years, and she immediately recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same expression he had worn when he had identified an opportunity that would change the trajectory of the entire company. Robert turned from the window and told them about Pinewood Shopping Center, about Derek Hoffman, about a little boy named Tommy who had asked Santa for a coat for his mother, and about the systematic corruption and cruelty that had been festering in a property they owned for 3 years without anyone noticing. He spread the evidence across the conference table like a prosecutor presenting a case, and his team sat in stunned silence as they reviewed financial documents that proved embezzlement, witness statements that detailed discrimination, and photographs that captured Derek's abuse of employees and customers. Margaret was the first to speak, and her voice was tight with controlled anger as she confirmed what Robert already knew. Derek Hoffman had violated at least 11 separate clauses in the management agreement, 5 federal anti-discrimination laws, and multiple state regulations regarding community access to public spaces. She calculated that the company could terminate his employment immediately with cause, pursue criminal charges for embezzlement, and sue for damages that would likely bankrupt him personally. Robert's chief legal counsel, James Martinez, added that they could also terminate the contract with the management company that had hired Derek, install their own management team, and restructure the entire operation of Pinewood Shopping Center within 30 days. But Robert shook his head and told them that was not enough, that simply firing one cruel manager and replacing him with another corporate functionary would not change anything fundamental about how the mall operated or who it served. What Robert proposed instead was something his team had never heard him suggest in 3 decades of ruthless business dealings. He wanted to transform Pinewood Shopping Center into a community-focused retail space that prioritized accessibility and inclusion over maximum profit extraction. He wanted to reduce parking fees to levels working-class families could afford. He wanted to recruit small businesses and local entrepreneurs for the empty kiosk spaces, offering them below-market rates and mentorship programs. He wanted to establish a legitimate community outreach program with proper oversight, funding holiday events for underprivileged children, providing meeting space for local nonprofits, and creating a partnership with social services to help homeless individuals access resources. He wanted to turn the North Pole Santa setup into a year-round community center where families could access free services, and he wanted to name it the Michael Caldwell Memorial Community Hub in honor of his son. His team exchanged glances around the conference table, and Robert could read the concern in their expressions. His chief financial officer, David Park, cautiously pointed out that Robert's proposal would reduce the property's profitability by approximately 30 to 40%, that shareholders would question the decision, and that it set a precedent that could affect how they managed their other properties. Robert listened patiently and then reminded them of something they seemed to have forgotten. He was not just the CEO of Caldwell Real Estate Holdings, he was the majority shareholder with 68% ownership, which meant he did not need anyone's permission to make decisions about how his properties were used. He told them that he had spent 5 years building wealth for the sake of building wealth, accumulating numbers in bank accounts that meant nothing because he had nobody to share them with and no purpose beyond acquisition. Michael's death had taught him that money without meaning was just paper, and if he could not use his fortune to create the kind of world his son had believed in, then what exactly was the point of having it? Margaret Chen smiled, and it was the kind of smile that contained both sadness and pride, and she told Robert that she would personally oversee the transformation of Pinewood Shopping Center and make sure it became everything he envisioned. James Martinez confirmed that he would handle all the legal aspects of Derek's termination and prosecution. David Park, despite his financial concerns, nodded and said he would restructure the property's budget to accommodate the new community-focused model. The rest of the team fell in line, and Robert felt something he had not experienced since Michael's funeral. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do. But before any of the transformation could begin, there was one final piece of business that required his personal attention, and that was the public exposure and termination of Derek Hoffman in a manner that would ensure the man never forgot the consequences of cruelty. Robert spent the next 2 weeks meticulously planning the confrontation because he understood that justice was not about rage or revenge, but about creating a moment so perfectly calibrated that it would serve as both punishment and education. He wanted Derek Hoffman to understand exactly what he had done wrong, to feel the full weight of his actions in front of the same community he had terrorized, and to serve as a warning to anyone else who believed that power gave them permission to treat vulnerable people as disposable. Robert coordinated with Margaret Chen to schedule a mandatory all-staff meeting at Pinewood Shopping Center for December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, telling Derek through official channels that corporate leadership would be conducting their annual review and holiday address. Derek, who had no idea that his entire world was about to collapse, had actually seemed excited about the meeting, apparently believing it was an opportunity to showcase his management skills to executives who might promote him to oversee multiple properties. Robert also did something that surprised even himself. He tracked down Tommy and his mother. He hired a private investigator, not to intrude on their privacy, but simply to locate them and understand their situation more completely, and what he discovered broke his heart in ways he had not thought possible anymore. Tommy's mother, whose name was Elena Rodriguez, was 32 years old and working 2 jobs, one as a night shift cleaner at an office building and another as a morning cashier at a grocery store, while also caring for her elderly mother who had advanced diabetes. Elena's husband had died 3 years ago in a construction accident, leaving her with no life insurance and medical debt that consumed most of her income. Tommy was her only child, a straight-A student at a struggling public school, and despite everything Elena was enduring, she had been saving $15 every week in a coffee can hidden in their apartment, trying to accumulate enough money to buy Tommy a winter coat that actually fit him properly. Robert arranged for his assistant to anonymously deliver winter coats, groceries, and a prepaid credit card with $5,000 to Elena's apartment, along with a note that said the gift was from Santa's workshop and that Tommy's wish had been heard. He also established a trust fund in Tommy's name that would cover his education from elementary school through university, with Elena as the trustee. But he structured it through a foundation so she would never know the money came from the billionaire who had been wearing a Santa suit the day her son was humiliated. Robert did not want gratitude or recognition. He wanted Elena and Tommy to have the security and dignity they deserved, and he wanted to do it in a way that honored Michael's belief that helping others should be about their needs rather than the helper's ego. The investigation into Derek's embezzlement had also yielded additional discoveries that made Robert's case even stronger. Derek had been falsifying occupancy reports to corporate headquarters, inflating the numbers to make Pinewood Shopping Center appear more successful than it actually was, which had affected property valuations and tax assessments in ways that could expose the company to legal liability. He had also been accepting bribes from certain retail chains in exchange for premium locations, and favorable lease terms, pocketing approximately $35,000 over 18 months in unreported income. Robert's legal team had built a case so airtight that 3 separate lawyers had confirmed Derek would likely face criminal prosecution, civil lawsuits from the company, and professional destruction so complete that he would never work in retail management again. On the morning of December 23rd, Robert drove to Pinewood Shopping Center in a rented sedan, dressed in one of his expensive suits for the first time in weeks, and he felt a strange mixture of anticipation and sadness. He was about to deliver justice for Tommy, for Elena, for all the employees and customers Derek had abused, and for Michael's memory. But he also knew that destroying someone's career, even someone who deserved it, was not something to celebrate. It was simply necessary. Margaret Chen met him in the parking lot, and together they walked through the mall's main entrance, passing the North Pole setup, where a different volunteer Santa was listening to children's wishes, and Robert remembered sitting in that chair, feeling Michael's presence for the first time in years, understanding that his son had brought him to this moment for a reason. The conference room on the second floor was packed with every employee, every store manager, every security guard and janitor and cashier who worked at Pinewood, and at the front of the room, looking confident and self-satisfied, stood Derek Hoffman, who had absolutely no idea that his life was about to change forever. Derek Hoffman stood at the front of the conference room, wearing his most expensive suit, a charcoal grey ensemble that probably cost more than most of his employees earned in a month, and he was smiling with the kind of confidence that came from believing he was untouchable. He had prepared a presentation about his management achievements, complete with PowerPoint slides, showing revenue projections and customer satisfaction metrics that Robert knew were completely fabricated, and Derek kept glancing at his watch, as if he were annoyed that the corporate executives were running late. The room was filled with approximately 90 people, store managers sitting in folding chairs, hourly employees standing along the walls, security personnel near the exits, and Robert could feel the tension in the air because these people had learned to fear these mandatory meetings, where Derek typically used the audience as an opportunity to publicly criticize individuals and remind everyone of their expendability. Robert entered through the back door of the conference room, with Margaret Chen and James Martinez flanking him, and he watched Derek's face carefully as the manager turned to see who had arrived. There was a flicker of confusion first, because Derek did not recognize Robert. Why would he when Robert had only existed in his presence as the anonymous man in a Santa suit? And then there was a moment of performative professionalism as Derek prepared to greet what he assumed were mid-level corporate representatives. Robert walked slowly down the center aisle between the rows of chairs, and he could see employees recognizing something in his demeanor, the way he carried himself, the expensive watch on his wrist, the subtle markers of real power that Derek tried to imitate but never quite achieved. Margaret moved to the laptop controlling the projector and replaced Derek's presentation with her own, and the first slide that appeared on the screen behind Derek simply showed the Caldwell Real Estate Holdings logo and the title, Property Management Review and Corrective Action. Derek's smile faltered slightly, and he extended his hand to Robert as he reached the front of the room, introducing himself as the general manager and saying how honored he was to meet someone from corporate leadership. Robert did not shake his hand. He simply stood there, looking at Derek with an expression of cold assessment, and then he told the room in a clear, calm voice that he was Robert Caldwell, founder and CEO of Caldwell Real Estate Holdings, majority owner of the parent company that held the master lease for Pinewood Shopping Center, and that he was here to address serious violations of company policy, contractual obligations, and basic human decency. The room went completely silent. Derek's hand was still extended in the air, frozen in the moment of rejection, and Robert watched the color drain from the manager's face as understanding began to dawn. Robert turned away from Derek and addressed the room directly, telling the assembled employees that he owed them an apology because his company had failed in its oversight responsibilities, had allowed a toxic management culture to develop, and had not protected them from the abuse of power they had been enduring. He told them that over the past 3 weeks, he had personally investigated operations at Pinewood Shopping Center, that he had witnessed and documented systematic discrimination against customers based on economic status, that he had uncovered financial crimes, including embezzlement and fraud, and that he had collected testimony from employees describing a workplace environment characterized by intimidation and cruelty. Margaret advanced the slides behind him, and the screen began displaying evidence. Photographs of Derek berating employees, financial records showing the embezzled funds, copies of the falsified occupancy reports, documentation of the parking fee increases that had priced out working families, and witness statements from 15 different employees describing incidents of harassment and discrimination. Derek tried to interrupt, his voice climbing in pitch as he claimed there had been some kind of mistake, that he had only been trying to maintain standards and protect the mall's reputation, that every decision he had made was in the best interest of the property and the company. Robert held up one hand for silence, and something in his gesture made Derek stop talking immediately, and Robert could see the manager finally understanding that he was not in a negotiation or a discussion, but in an execution. Robert told Derek that he had violated 11 separate clauses of his management agreement, that he had embezzled approximately $45,000 from community outreach funds, that he had accepted bribes totaling $35,000, that he had falsified corporate reports, and that he had systematically discriminated against customers and employees in ways that exposed the company to significant legal liability. Margaret handed Robert a folder, and he opened it to show Derek the termination paperwork, already signed and legally binding, effective immediately, with cause, meaning Derek would receive no severance, no references, and no possibility of future employment in retail management. Derek's legs seemed to buckle slightly, and he gripped the edge of the table in front of him as if he needed physical support to remain standing. His face had gone from pale to red, a flush of humiliation and panic spreading across his features, and he began stammering excuses and justifications that made no logical sense, claiming that he had only been following industry standards, that other malls operated the same way, that Robert was overreacting to minor management decisions. Robert let him talk for approximately 30 seconds, and then he said in a voice that cut through Derek's desperate rambling like a knife that there was one incident in particular he wanted to address. One moment that had prompted this entire investigation and ultimately led to Derek's termination. He told the room about December 15th, about a 7-year-old boy named Tommy who had asked Santa for a winter coat for his sick mother, and about how Derek had physically removed that child from Santa's lap and expelled him from the mall for being poor. The room reacted with a collective intake of breath, and Robert saw several employees nodding as if this story confirmed things they had suspected or witnessed themselves. Derek's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, then recognition, then horror as he realized that Santa Claus, the volunteer he had ordered around and condescended to, had been Robert Caldwell himself. Derek tried to defend himself, saying that the incident had been taken out of context, that he had been trying to maintain a certain atmosphere for paying customers, that homeless people and beggars were bad for business, and with every word he spoke, he dug his grave deeper. Robert asked Derek if he knew what had happened to Tommy and his mother after they were expelled from the mall, and Derek said nothing, because of course he did not know and had never bothered to wonder. Robert told the room that Elena Rodriguez worked 2 jobs to support her son and her elderly mother, that she was drowning in medical debt from her late husband's final illness, that she had been saving $15 per week to buy her son a proper coat, and that Derek's cruelty had crushed what little Christmas spirit that family had managed to preserve, despite their struggles. Robert then did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He told them about Michael, about his son who had died 5 years ago, about how Michael had made it his mission every Christmas to think about other children who needed help, about how sitting in that Santa chair had been Robert's way of honoring his son's memory and reconnecting with the values Michael had embodied. He told them that Michael would have been 13 years old now, probably too old to believe in Santa Claus, but definitely not too old to care about kids like Tommy, and that watching Derek humiliate a child for the crime of poverty had felt like watching someone desecrate everything Michael had stood for. Robert's voice remained steady as he spoke, but several employees in the room were wiping their eyes, and even Margaret Chen, who prided herself on professional composure, looked visibly moved. Derek, sensing that the room's sympathy was entirely against him, made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. He turned to the assembled employees and appealed to them directly. asking if they really wanted to work for a company that prioritized charity cases over profits, reminding them that his management style had kept their jobs secure, suggesting that Robert's sentimentality would lead to the mall's financial collapse and their unemployment. It was exactly the wrong thing to say. One of the store managers, a woman named Patricia who had worked at Pinewood for 12 years, stood up and told Derek that she had watched him humiliate her teenage daughter, who worked as a seasonal cashier, calling the girl stupid in front of customers because she had made a minor mistake on a transaction. A security guard named Marcus stood next and said that Derek had ordered him to harass and follow any customer who looked poor, and that he had been documenting these illegal instructions for months, hoping someone from corporate would eventually care enough to investigate. One by one, employees began standing and sharing their stories, and Robert watched Derek's face transform from defensive anger to something resembling genuine fear as he realized that he had not just lost his job, but his reputation and quite possibly his freedom. A janitor named Luis described being forced to work unpaid overtime under threat of deportation, even though Luis was a legal citizen, and Derek had no authority to threaten anyone with immigration consequences. A kiosk vendor named Sarah explained that Derek had demanded monthly bribes to maintain her lease, and when she had refused, he had threatened to relocate her to a spot with no foot traffic. The testimonies continued for 20 minutes, and with each story, Derek seemed to shrink, his shoulders curling forward, his confident posture collapsing into something that looked like a man finally understanding the magnitude of what he had done. Robert let every person speak who wanted to, because this was not just about Derek's termination. It was about giving voice to people who had been silenced by fear and about creating a record of testimony that would ensure Derek never had the opportunity to abuse power again. When the testimonies finally ended, Robert turned back to Derek and informed him that James Martinez, the chief legal counsel standing beside him, would be coordinating with local law enforcement regarding criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud, and that the company would be pursuing civil litigation to recover all stolen funds plus damages. Derek's expensive suit suddenly looked like a costume on a man who had been playing a role he was never qualified to perform, and he asked in a voice barely above a whisper if there was any way to resolve this situation privately, if perhaps he could return the money and resign quietly without criminal charges. Robert's response was immediate and unambiguous. There would be no private resolution, no quiet resignation, no opportunity for Derek to slink away and reinvent himself at another property in another city. This exposure was public and permanent, because the people Derek had harmed deserved to see justice delivered in the open, and because other managers in other malls needed to understand that cruelty had consequences that extended beyond bad publicity. Robert then addressed the employees again and told them that effective immediately, Pinewood Shopping Center would be operating under new management principles that prioritized community service alongside commercial success. Margaret Chen would be personally overseeing the transition, which would include reducing parking fees by 60%, eliminating all discriminatory security practices, recruiting local small businesses for retail spaces at below market rates, and establishing the Michael Caldwell Memorial Community Hub, a year-round resource center for families in need. He told them that nobody would lose their jobs during this transition, that in fact the company would be hiring additional staff to support the expanded community programming, and that any employee who had experienced retaliation or abuse under Derek's management would have the opportunity to speak with human resources about remediation and support. The room erupted in applause, and Robert saw tears on the faces of people who had apparently spent months or years believing that nobody with power cared about what they were experiencing. Derek was escorted from the building by security, and Robert watched through the conference room window as the former manager walked across the parking lot to his leased sports car, his movements those of a man in shock, and Robert felt no satisfaction in the moment, only a quiet sense of completion. He had done what needed to be done, what Michael would have wanted him to do, and now the real work would begin, the work of transformation, of building something meaningful from the ruins of Derek's corrupt little kingdom. Margaret gathered the management team for a working session to begin implementing the changes immediately, and Robert excused himself because there was one more piece of unfinished business that required his personal attention, One more visit he needed to make before this chapter could truly close. Robert drove to the address his private investigator had provided, a modest apartment building in a neighborhood where the streets needed repair and the buildings needed paint, and he climbed 3 flights of stairs to apartment 312. He knocked on the door, and after a moment, it opened to reveal Elena Rodriguez, whose face showed the exhaustion of someone who worked 2 jobs and slept too little, but whose eyes widened in surprise when she recognized the man standing in her hallway. Robert had been the Santa Claus in the mall that day, even though she had never seen his face without the beard, and somehow she knew exactly who he was. He asked if he could speak with her and Tommy for just a few minutes, and Elena hesitated before stepping aside to let him enter, and Robert understood that hesitation. She had learned the hard way that people with power rarely brought good news to people without it. The apartment was small but immaculately clean, decorated with handmade Christmas ornaments and a modest tree that Tommy had clearly decorated himself with construction paper chains and crayon drawings. Tommy was sitting at a small table doing homework, and when he saw Robert, his eyes went wide and he asked if he was the Santa Claus from the mall, the one who had been nice to him before the mean man had grabbed him. Robert knelt down so he was at Tommy's eye level and told him that yes, he had been that Santa, and that he wanted to apologize for what had happened that day. And more importantly, he wanted to tell Tommy that his Christmas wish had been granted. Elena looked confused, and Robert explained about the winter coats and groceries and prepaid card that had been delivered to their apartment a week ago. The anonymous gift they had assumed came from a church charity or a community organization. Elena's hand went to her mouth, and she asked Robert why he had done this, why a stranger would care about her family's struggles, and Robert found himself telling her the truth about Michael, about losing his son 5 years ago, about how Tommy's selfless wish had reminded him of everything his own child had valued and believed in. He told her that helping her family was not charity in the traditional sense, but rather an act of gratitude, because Tommy had given him something precious without even knowing it, a reason to feel hope during Christmas again, a purpose that extended beyond accumulating wealth, a connection to his son's memory that felt alive rather than suffocating. Elena began to cry, not the tears of someone receiving pity, but the tears of someone who had been carrying an impossible weight alone and suddenly realized she did not have to carry it by herself anymore. Tommy, not fully understanding the adult conversation but sensing its emotional significance, came over and hugged Robert with the unself-conscious affection that only children possess, and Robert felt something break open inside his chest, a dam of grief that had been holding back 5 years of unfelt emotions. Robert stayed in that small apartment for nearly 2 hours, drinking instant coffee that Elena apologized for not being better quality, listening to Tommy talk about school and his dreams of becoming a veterinarian someday because he loved animals, hearing Elena describe her late husband and the life they had planned before the construction accident had shattered everything. Robert did not tell them about the trust fund he had established for Tommy's education, because that was information they would discover later through official channels, and he did not want this moment to be about money or grand gestures. He simply wanted to be present with these people who had inadvertently saved him from his own emotional numbness, and he wanted them to know that their struggles mattered, that their dignity mattered, that they were seen and valued by someone who had the power to make a difference in their lives. When he finally left their apartment, Tommy gave him a drawing he had made, a crayon picture of Santa Claus with the words, "Thank you for listening," written in careful child's handwriting, and Robert folded that drawing and put it in his wallet, where it would remain for years to come. The transformation of Pinewood Shopping Center began immediately, and Robert visited the property every week throughout the following months to oversee the changes personally. The parking fees were reduced within 3 days, and families who had stopped visiting the mall because they could not afford the cost began returning, bringing with them an energy and diversity that had been systematically excluded under Derek's management. Small business owners and local entrepreneurs were recruited for the empty kiosk spaces, and Margaret negotiated lease terms that allowed them to establish themselves without the crushing overhead that typically destroyed new ventures. The Michael Caldwell Memorial Community Hub opened in February, occupying the space where the North Pole Santa setup had been, and it became a resource center offering free services including job placement assistance, after-school tutoring, legal aid clinics and a food pantry stocked through partnerships with local grocers and restaurants. The criminal prosecution of Derek Hoffman moved forward with the efficiency that Robert's legal team was known for, and by March, Derek had pled guilty to embezzlement and fraud charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 18 months in minimum security prison, 5 years of probation, and full restitution of the stolen funds. The civil lawsuit resulted in a judgment that would follow Derek for decades, ensuring that any future income he managed to earn would be garnished until the company was fully compensated for damages. More importantly, Derek's name became a cautionary tale in retail management circles, a reminder that abusing power had real consequences, and Robert received calls from executives at other shopping centers asking for guidance on implementing similar community-focused management principles at their properties. Robert did not advertise these consultations or seek recognition for them, but he answered every call and shared everything he had learned because the goal was never personal glory but systemic change. The story of what had happened at Pinewood Shopping Center spread through local news outlets and eventually national media, and reporters wanted to interview Robert about the billionaire who had disguised himself as Santa Claus to investigate corruption, but he declined all interview requests except one. He agreed to speak with a journalist from a small community newspaper on the condition that the story focus not on him, but on Elena Rodriguez and the employees who had found the courage to testify against Derek, despite their fear of retaliation. The article that resulted was titled, "When Santa Listened, How One Family's Christmas Wish Changed a Community," and it centered Elena's voice and Tommy's story, mentioning Robert only as someone who had been in the right place at the right time to make a difference. That article was picked up by wire services and reproduced in newspapers across the country, and the response was overwhelming. Donations poured into the Michael Caldwell Memorial Community Hub from strangers who had been moved by the story. Other shopping centers began contacting Margaret about implementing similar programs, and most importantly, families like Elena's began to believe that maybe the system was not entirely stacked against them. Robert Caldwell returned to Pinewood Shopping Center on Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after the confrontation that had changed everything, and he wore the Santa suit again because the tradition had become something sacred to him, an annual ritual of remembrance and connection that honored Michael's memory in the most authentic way possible. The North Pole setup had been relocated to the Michael Caldwell Memorial Community Hub, and the space had been transformed into something far more beautiful than a commercial photo opportunity. It was now a warm, welcoming environment where families could visit Santa without pressure to purchase expensive picture packages, where cookies and hot chocolate were provided free of charge, and where volunteers worked year-round to ensure that every LD who asked for help actually received it. Tommy was there with Elena, both of them volunteering to help distribute gifts to other families, and when Tommy saw Robert in the Santa suit, he ran over with excitement that had not dimmed, despite now being 8 years old, and probably beginning to suspect that Santa might not be exactly what he had believed as a younger child. The line of children waiting to see Santa stretched through the community hub and out into the mall corridor, and Robert sat in that chair for 6 hours, listening to wishes that ranged from toys and games to requests for help with family struggles, and he made notes about every child who asked for something their parents could not afford, knowing that his foundation would follow up to ensure those wishes were granted with dignity and privacy. He saw families who had been banned or discouraged from visiting the mall under Derek's regime, now returning with smiles and relief, and he saw employees who had testified against Derek now working with pride and confidence, no longer afraid that speaking truth would cost them their livelihoods. Margaret Chen stopped by during the evening shift and told Robert that Pinewood Shopping Center's revenue had actually increased by 22% over the past year, proving that community-focused management and commercial success were not mutually exclusive concepts, and that 3 other Caldwell properties were implementing similar transformation programs based on the Pinewood model. As the evening drew to a close and the last child left Santa's lap, Robert sat alone in the quiet community hub, surrounded by decorations that Michael would have loved, and he felt his son's presence more strongly than he had at any point since the funeral 5 years ago. He was not haunted by Michael's death anymore. Instead, he was inspired by Michael's life, by the values his son had embodied, by the belief that every person deserved dignity and kindness, regardless of their economic circumstances. Robert had spent 5 years trying to fill the void Michael left behind, with money and acquisitions and professional achievements that meant nothing, and it had taken a 7-year-old boy asking Santa for a coat for his mother to wake him up from that sleepwalk through existence. Tommy's wish had not just helped Elena, it had saved Robert from becoming the kind of person Michael would have been ashamed to call his father. Robert removed the Santa suit for the final time that evening, carefully hanging it in the storage closet, where next year's volunteer would find it, and he walked through Pinewood Shopping Centre, observing the changes that had occurred over 12 months. The mall was busier than it had been in years, filled with diverse families from every economic background, and the atmosphere was warm and inclusive rather than cold and commercial. Store owners reported that their sales had improved because the increased foot traffic from lower-income families actually spent more consistently than the wealthy shoppers Derek had tried to attract, and the community partnership programs had generated positive publicity that brought customers from surrounding areas who specifically wanted to support a business that valued social responsibility. Robert had proven something important, not just to his executive team or to the retail industry, but to himself, that success measured solely in profit margins was empty, but success measured in positive impact created a legacy worth leaving. He drove back to Manhattan that night, and for the first time in 5 years, his penthouse apartment did not feel like a mausoleum. He had filled it with photographs of Michael, with the drawings Tommy had given him, with news clippings about the community hub and letters from families who had been helped by the programs his foundation supported. Robert had discovered that grief did not have to be a weight that crushed you. It could be transformed into purpose, into action, into a force that created positive change in the world. Michael was gone, and that loss would never stop hurting. But Michael's values were alive in every family that visited the community hub, in every employee who worked without fear of abuse, in every child who sat on Santa's lap and dared to ask for help. Robert had learned that the greatest revenge against death was not to stop living, but to live so intentionally and compassionately that the person you lost would be proud of who you became in their absence. And he had learned that justice was not about destroying your enemies, but about building systems that prevented future harm while healing past wounds. He fell asleep that Christmas Eve with Tommy's crayon drawing on his nightstand and a sense of peace that he had not thought possible, knowing that tomorrow he would wake up and continue the work Michael had started, one act of kindness at a time, one transformed shopping center at a time, one protected child at a time, until the day he could finally see his son again and tell him that he had tried his very best to make the world a little bit be TTR.